Welcome back to LaidOPEN Podcast. During the hiatus, I finally finished my highly anticipated course, Pathways to Peace: Mindful Practices for Transformative and Vibrant Living. Even as I've been working on creating this course, I've used these exact tools to guide myself through situations that reactivated my childhood PTSD. I will teach you these skills along with how to understand your nervous system and reactions, how to think more clearly and gain perspective, how to translate the ways your body communicates through physical sensations, how to identify emotions, where they come from, and what they're telling you, how to discover why you react in ways that produce shame and learn tools to manage these reactions, how to reduce your anxiety and destructive impulses, and how to diminish self-hatred when you are not your best self. The early bird offer starts July 1st, so mark your calendar because it will only be offered for a limited time. If you want to learn more before then, and I hope you do, you can go to my courses page, which is courses.charnacassell, that's CASSELL.com for more information. Today's guest is Mark Walsh. And Mark and I know each other from over 20 years ago when we trained at the Strozzi Institute, and he's all grown up now. Well, welcome, Mark.
Learn how to live embodied. Your life is about to unwind. Uncover new tools and start healing. Leave trauma and tension behind. Isn't it great laid open? Let all your desires come true. How can you live laid open? Imagine yourself brand new. Imagine yourself brand new.
You haven't aged, but I definitely have. So nice to see you again, Charna.
Well, you've been up to some remarkable things, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you. So thank you for your time. I know it's full and precious.
Yeah, I've been a busy boy. These days, a little bit more spacious, but yeah, it's been a busy 20 years.
Yeah. So you're mainly, you are known as a coach, and you also have the Embodiment Podcast, and you're over there in England. Where are you exactly?
I'm near Stonehenge, so I'm in the west of England in a little hippie town called Frome, which may be near Bath. People have probably heard of, which is,
Okay.
where the Roman baths are. So in the green, kind of looks like Hobbiton out the window, like green rolling hills. So.
That sounds, my whole body just relaxes and softens when I picture
There's
that.
ancestral resourcing happening.
Right. You're tapping back, 5 generations. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know that you have a very full life with the things I just listed, but what's exciting you right now? What are you thinking a lot about or engaging in?
Most of my life is training coaches and embodiment. That's my main thing. Supporting charity in Ukraine is always a pleasure. I always love making creative things. Like we just made a book on people pleasing. We do a lot of YouTube, a lot of videos, a lot of content. The one nice thing about being ADHD and not having a filter, while it gets me in a lot of trouble, means I'm constantly making good content, which I enjoy a lot. I think a topic that's fascinating for me right now is why we're all fucking crazy. So I've noticed with increasing disturbance, how unwell the world is. And I'm in, 20 countries a year, and everywhere I go, people seem more and more insane. I think we just hit a wall we've been heading towards for several hundred years. That really interests me. Like, what can be done about that? Because, we're doing a pretty interesting experiment, which is how crazy can we make everyone and still have a society that more or less functions? I'm not sure that's a great experiment. So, I've been thinking about that a lot.
Are you thinking a lot about how it may relate to COVID and isolation, or you're just beyond that? You made a little.
Yeah, the twig, well picked up. So I think for some young people, like I've got a lot of friends with teenage kids, and it's a major factor for them. It's multifactorial, which means there's no one solution. But I think maybe that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, we've been heading towards increasing social isolating and lack of co-regulation for the last, let's say, 5,000 years, but particularly the last 300 years.
These guys don't help, right? I'm holding my phone up for people
Technology
who can't see.
is a big
Right.
one. I mean, postmodernity, culture, technology, there are economics, there are a number of factors there. And, if anyone offers you, like, if you say why are people crazy, that's such a big question. If anyone offers
Yeah,
you
of course.
that they're selling something. So yeah, definitely. I think tech is a big one. I'm very interested in where AI is going and tech and, where that's leading, because embodiment and tech are kind of complementary kind of sides of things. So yeah, that's all very interesting to me.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting to be in the mental health field right now regarding that, because I used to, before COVID, before things were so remote, when someone would do telehealth, I would think it was a little wacky, given I really
Mhm.
value presence, I value
Yeah.
touch, I value embodiment. And I saw that there was still some value online, but I still feel like I can feel people better over a phone than through a video. And I notice myself, and I don't know,
It's
I mean, there is something to Zoom brain, but it's like I'm so much more tired from.
Yeah, everyone's, I say dead, distracted, exhausted. It's, what's the A? I forget the A. And depressed, anxious and depressed, and then the
Mm,
exhausted is part of it, And I think some of that is just lack of co-regulation. Some of that is certain kind of more spiritual and psychological factors. I mean, for me, I want a girlfriend, not a pen pal. For me, I
mhm,
know, for example, if I'm doing a podcast with someone that I've spent 3 days dancing with, that podcast goes so much better than if I just met them online. I mean, even
mm,
someone like you who I've got an embodied memory of that's 20 years old is a hell of a lot better than nothing compared to someone if I'm being interviewed by someone for the very first time.
mm.
So I think maybe COVID and maybe the tech is teaching us what embodiment is and why it matters. Like, I think COVID underlined what co-regulation is and the importance of touch and the importance of connection and community in a way that maybe to us is obvious, but wasn't necessarily obvious to lawmakers and, people that weren't factoring that in their decision making.
Right, right.
So yeah, when things kind of hit a crisis point, the things that have been keeping us sane all the years or, the generations all of a sudden become more obvious rather than just invisible.
Well, and I think that there's actually the positive piece was, clients who were incredibly anxious or OCD or had different concerns before COVID, they suddenly
Yeah.
felt normal, right? So it was kind of like all the
Everyone's
things that
cleaning
were
out.
well, that everything that's suppressed, everything's just that's just like right under the surface,
Yeah.
that subconscious that we're not putting our attention on. Suddenly it's spring and everything's blooming, right? So the crazy's out
Right.
until you see something, right? If, like, when I garden and when I plant bulbs, like I'll plant a bunch of bulbs and then I'll be like, oh my God, I don't know where there's space to plant something else, right? And so until it blooms, you can't see it. And until you see it, you can't address it. So I'm just thinking,
Mm.
like, in a way, the glass half full version of it, yes, things are highly escalated in so many ways, but until they break through the surface and they're visible, we can't actually address them. And hopefully, we're coming up with some new solutions as things fall apart. They have to come together, hopefully, in a new way. That's a that's totally optimistic.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Get things out in the open. The joke I make is someone with ADHD is, because of technology, everybody else is ADHD now. I'm like, oh yeah, you've all got it too now. Cool. Welcome to welcome to Squirrel Club.
Hmm.
And I think it's
Right.
like that with anxiety and depression and trauma and many other things. I would say though that people don't know how bad things can get. Like I just the weekend watched the movie Civil War about a modern American civil war, which
Hmm.
historian friends of mine say is quite likely to happen. And I
Yeah.
got a friend about it afterwards, and he said, "Oh my God, man's inhumanity to man. It's so depressing." And I laughed and I said, "That was a really tame film." Having been around several really serious civil wars like Sierra Leone and Afghanistan, there was nothing nearly as nasty in that film as a civil war would really get. And
Hmm.
we have been America has a particular geography, which means it's hard to invade. And we have been through the period of what's called the Big Peace in history, which is very unlikely to sustain and very unusual in human history. So at the risk of depressing all our listeners, the glass isn't half empty, the glass is smashed.
Yeah. Well, and you're doing some important work, and you started would you say it's a foundation? You do training for volunteers in Ukraine
Yeah,
to pro
it's now a registered charity in Ukraine. So, I went out there, delivered a bunch of medical supplies, and then started training people to teach people about trauma. So, I've been going to Ukraine on and off for 10 years. I met my wife actually, as an interpreter in Ukraine years ago. So I had the connections and I knew people, and they basically said, look, we don't have enough psychologists, but people who are just smart young people with a bit of psychology can actually do a lot of good just by informing people around trauma without actually doing therapy, like trauma education rather than therapy, which you can train much quicker than therapy. So I, trained a couple of hundred trauma educators out there. And then I've been supervising them, and at a certain point, really smart young women nearly always, because the men are all in the military. And I've been supervising them, and at a certain point I said, look, you girls are smart, you know what you're doing. Why don't I just hand it over to them? And now it's a registered charity in Ukraine. And I mean, they made Lviv the world's most trauma-informed city, and now they're working on Kiev and Odessa. So, I mean, I'm very, very proud of what those young women have achieved.
I was listening to an episode, and I can't remember the woman's name that you were interviewing, that she was someone who had trained with you, and what was her name, please?
Her name is Christina. She's one of the team. She's regularly teaching soldiers on the front line, and she calls me Trauma Daddy, which is a fucked up term. And she regularly sends me little voice messages and this thing's blowing up in the background. I'm like, it worries the shit out of me, but I'm very proud of her. So yeah, she's one of the main trainers.
I really enjoyed the conversation between the two of you in terms of, thinking about the process of establishing that training and all that goes into creating that. I mean, I think that so many people are sitting in experiences of powerlessness and want to do something. And, the dialogue that you were in with yourself was like, do I go and fight? Well, no, actually, I have the skills to do this other thing, right? To offer training, right?
Yes,
Um,
that was a good decision. Thank you to my friend Alex. He nudged me. He was like, Mark, if you go fight, you're just going to get killed because you're a rubbish soldier, but you're a very good trauma teacher. So why don't you go do that? So, yes, that's Alex Audi, runs the Trauma Super Conference. Shout out, good friend of mine. I think we all need to make use of our talents. And I don't really think things through, and I have an unrealistic sense of my own capacities. And that means that I do stuff sometimes gets me in hot water. In this case, there was a lot of grace involved, that it all worked out quite well.
which is remarkable. I mean, if you're someone who's an over planner, you probably feel defeated before you begin, But one of the things that the two of you were talking about, which is here you are, you're in a war zone, and you're trying to do this education in your real life, like live action, getting the responses, the fight, flight, freeze responses. You don't have to do any probes or
No, very
provoke anything,
helpful. Very
right?
helpful. I mean, it is inconvenient doing half the training in a bomb shelter. I'm now a bomb shelter connoisseur. When I pick venues now, I'm like, what a lovely bomb shelter, excellent bomb shelter. This was bomb shelter with Wi-Fi. It's fantastic. So yeah, I mean, you don't really have to do exercises when you're getting rocket attacked or, whatever. So it does give a live action way of training things. I mean, jokes aside, the last training we did in Krakow, because I said, girls, fuck this. We need to get some work done. It's much easier to do it in Poland, in a nice place, overlooking the opera house in Poland, and everyone's eating nice food and having a nice time. It's just way easier when the nervous system's settled to learn anything.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a real challenge doing training in life-threatening areas. It's not, I wouldn't recommend it. We had to spend several hours a day just keeping everyone kind of calm enough and well-regulated enough to learn. Whereas in Poland, we don't have to do that. That was the last training we did, was like an advanced training. So yeah, there's definitely challenges to that kind of thing.
Well, and then there's as you noted, it's like when your brain is in high beta brain, like when the brain waves are in high beta fight flight, you're not able to think clearly. You can't take in new information. A lot of the work that I'm doing in this very tame zone of
Yes.
like couples therapy, or teaching co-regulation to a couple, is how important it is to get back into this window of what I call window of capacity to be with your emotions and sensations, like how to regulate yourself or regulate with another person before you can finish that hard conversation, right?
War zones are far less scary than couples counseling, though, having done both.
Yeah.
That's far more intense. There's too much attachment and emotional stuff involved. You don't have attachment issues with a bomb. But yeah, I'm with you. We need to keep people in that space of sort of rest, digest, and connect is the key thing, right? Where we can actually learn, we can take in new information, we can empathize. I mean, that all goes out the window with enough stress.
Well, and so again, just coming back to kind of the awe for me, knowing, I was doing trauma education with teachers at an orphanage in Nepal and with the kids, and then giving them the resources like trauma and resilience education to then do that work with their students, and for the kids to then do that work with each other. And the conditions, obviously they're way less stressful, and even still seeing with just talking about trauma and seeing things elevate in people. And then we would take a tea break, and then they would naturally, like, they would actually sing and dance. That was just bred into
Yeah.
their
Most
culture,
cultures
right?
do. I
Right.
mean,
And
it's only really white people who don't do that all the time.
exactly. So I was curious about that. I was curious about the embodiment practices in between
Yes.
the psychoeducation about trauma. Like, what were you getting to do with people to regulate them?
Well, Ukrainians are East Europeans, so then like Southern Europeans, they're not like North Europeans and North Americans. So they've still got some of that cultural heritage. Like a lot of we say, like, joking about white people. Well, that's several different groups actually. And East Europeans don't suffer the problems Germans and English and, North Americans have
Mhm.
in that regard. So, for example, there is a nice video of them singing in a bomb shelter, which is, singing some songs, which is very co-regulatory, and dancing as well. There's a number of Ukrainian dances we played with.
Mhm.
But then, we did metta meditation every morning. We did TRE shaking. We did EFT tapping. We did various somatic movement practices, various discharge practices, various calming practices. I tell a lot of jokes, which my sort of Anglo-Irish humor goes down very well in Ukraine. They also have a similarly dark sense of humor. So, I mean, if you see me do a trauma training, it looks like stand-up comedy. Mostly I'm using a lot of jokes, and they love the dark jokes. So, I mean, I won't use them on air because it would be too much for some listeners in California. But, they love that dark humor. So that's part of it as well. And so everything from dancing to singing to trauma release exercises. I forget some breathing exercises, a lot of centering from Paul Lindem, one of my main teachers. And it's actually what's really interesting is the team then went and trained like a few 100,000 people, and they came back and said, here's what works. And that was really interesting because most of the people who are teaching in the trauma world today, the rock stars of trauma, slightly bizarre
Mm.
phenomenon of since we met, for example, 20 years ago,
Mhm.
trauma become big business.
Isn't it crazy? I
It's
know,
mental.
yeah.
20 years ago, I was like, what's trauma? What now? It's like, this Bezel van der Kolk or Gabble Mate on the TV. It's bizarre.
I remember back, I mean, it was over 20 years ago, and just reading Waking the Tiger, right? It was one of the few
Yeah.
books, and Babette
Yeah.
Rothschild, and that there are a few
One of
books
many.
out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just remember being like, this book tells me that this is a trauma response. My anxiety is not who I am. And now it's a big field. But what were you going to say?
Most of the people working in trauma today really are disconnected from the kind of hardcore front line of trauma. I mean,
Yeah.
David Baselli of TRE is an exception because of his humanitarian work. He's a great guy. But most of them are sort of, living quite middle class, first world problem kind of environments. And
Yeah.
I actually, because of the conference we did and the podcast I have access to sort of all the, big names of trauma globally. And a lot of them I emailed before the Ukraine training and said, hey, you got any advice? What should I do? And some were very helpful, like Stephen Porges was very helpful, but a bunch said, I have no idea. I can't help you. They basically said, I don't really deal with real trauma. So in terms of like testing really what works on the sharp edge of things as well. Yeah, there is. I mean, also now it's big business. So everybody's selling a technique, right? And, we actually have a phrase in Ukraine, which is nothing works. And that's slightly sort of dark Ukrainian humor. What we mean is nothing works for everyone, always, all the time. So like, if you're not multimodality, if you're not looking at the wider perspective of things, then, you're really missing a trick. And I think, most people now are selling a modality, their own TM. And that's really changed in the time since I met you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating. We think what's changed since then. The world has changed. The mindfulness revolution, that's changed. The availability of mindfulness in the world. I mean, I used to be like, what the hell is embodiment? People used to ask me. And now more and more people have sort of some idea of what that is. I talked to a major publisher today, and they want to do like a little pictorial coffee table book about embodiment. And I was like, okay, wow, we've got mainstream now. Cool.
That's amazing. What's It's so funny. It's like, I used to be called an embodiment coach or, master somatic coach. Then I was like, well, maybe an embodiment coach. And then I was working with a business coach friend, and she was like, I don't think people know what embodiment is. And she's like, don't use that. Don't use that.
I mean, I used to do a lot of corporate work, like stress and leadership training. I still do a little bit of corporate, and I didn't even mention embodiment. I just say interactive leadership training, something like that. Say somatic, didn't say embodied. But I mean, now it's become almost a buzzword, and myself and other people have done a good job of popularizing the word and kind of getting it out. And like anything, it will have problems, is overused and misused, and it's already getting some funny connotations. So whatever.
How is it that this grabbed you so strongly and it became your path? Like, what is it
What do you mean?
about embodiment? Yeah, it's compelled you. I mean, similar to me, and I have my own story. So, what is it that?
Sure. Well, I think I was very disembodied, right? So, I mean, we always learn what we need, and then end up teaching it if you get good enough. Overshoot average and get into a skill that you can actually teach. So, I think for me, it was having a pretty traumatic childhood, and also being hyper intellectual. I grew up amongst teachers, and I was very cerebral. And what I found was, despite being very cerebral, that didn't actually solve my problems. Like everyone was telling me I was a genius, and in fact, I was really screwed up, and I was suicidal and alcoholic and all the rest of it. And as a teenager, I remember I was 18 years old. I'd fallen out of love for the first time. I was heartbroken in a way that I just didn't understand, because I had no relational skills, and I was drug and alcohol addicted and deeply suicidal. And I went to university. And I remember just walking past the library and going, I don't think the answer's in there, because I read the last library at my high school, what you would call high school. I literally read the library, every book. And I went, I don't think the answer's in there. And then I saw a poster up or whatever saying, Aikido. And I thought, okay, let's do some martial arts. That'd be good, because I was a sort of minor criminal at the time. And I thought it'd be helpful just from a sort of self-defense point of view. And I walked into an Aikido dojo, and I was like, oh, I don't know what this is, but I saw the movement and the power and the grace and the discipline. And I was like, oh, this is a form of education I haven't had, that you can't get from a book. Because I fell for the lie of Western society, which is knowledge is a learning about things rather than learning to do or to be. And that's become the theme of my life, is essentially being a better educator than I had access to. So I don't know, that's a sort of, all Genesis stories are lies, but there's some truth in that one.
I also want to acknowledge, just coming back to joking and laughter, like how essential it is, because it, on an energetic level, it's like it clears the energy, right? It resets the energy.
There's a few things. It does that and a few other things. It does about 9 things.
Yeah, go ahead to say more.
Well, okay. So humor's a big part of Anglo-Irish culture. I remember when I was in America, and it's not that there aren't great American stand-ups. There are, I love Dave Chappelle. There's so many stand-ups, like Bill Hicks. There's so many American stand-ups I love. But as a culture, it doesn't have humor in it in the same way as, say, Australia or South Africa, New Zealand, Ireland. If you go to the average building site in England, you'll hear just amazing banter, just amazing humor. I remember when I first went to a bar in America, and people said, you're hilariously funny. And, it's like you're a stand-up comedian. I was like, this is normal where I come from. But since then, I've really worked on it as a skill, because I realized that it has you can do, this is partly pulled in, and it's in the Jewish tradition quite strongly as well, actually. So I realized humor you can do things with humor you can't do with seriousness. So for example, like deepening connection, but also sometimes breaking connection. It can get you deeper into something, or if it's like, hey, it's coming towards the end of this session and we need to lighten things up, and let's get out of this a little bit, because I want this person wrapped up and ready to, go back to their life in 10 minutes. You can give bad news in a way you can't otherwise. You can plant seeds of intuitive knowledge, like with stories do this as well, that you can't just logically tell people. You can say the unsayable, which is a real problem that, people are coming after the woke crowd are coming after comedians, because comedians in a culture like the jester and the core actually perform a very important emotional function for everyone. So there's things you can do with humor that you just can't. Obviously there's dangers too, but there's things you can do with humor you just can't do elsewhere. So I like to think of myself as the funniest trauma trainer. And I'd love one day to do a course called Making Trauma Funny, which I think would be very wise.
Well, I
Right.
feel like it was a missed opportunity. I don't know why I didn't think to reach out to you. At the beginning of quarantine, that was one of the things I wanted to make funny trauma videos because I felt like that was key. It's like I wanted to do education,
Yes.
but I needed to have more laughter. And I wanted to offer that to people, right? I did
Yeah.
a one woman show close to 20 years ago. And it was about healing from trauma somatically, but also working at good vibrations, right? So like selling
For
sex
the sex shop.
toys, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was actually very funny, but it was
Mhm.
also about healing from sexual trauma, right? And so I saw the value of those two things of like how it would help people regulate from a more intense scene. And so perhaps you and I should make make some funny
We
trauma
could play with that.
videos.
It's also a good canary, right? Like whatever you don't have a sense of humor around, you're probably far too attached to. Like it's a canary that when the canary's dead, it tells you something, right? So it's like, what if people lost their sense of humor around these days? Like there's a whole bunch of topics. And also I think, lack of humor is a way of controlling people as well, because there is a liberating quality in it. And, as you say, you could, so it's like, why would you joke about dark things? It's so we can talk about them at all, like that's the only way you can talk about certain things with certain people. Talking about humor though isn't funny. It all gets very serious as soon as you talk about humor. But yeah, I think it's an underdone piece of the overly sincere personal growth world. And I'm not the only one, right? Like JP Spears has poked so much fun at the spirituality community. There's all sorts of other people who've poked fun at it in a way, which I think is really needed. When anything takes itself too seriously, the jester just pops up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and with all the polarization that's occurring, like I'm picturing you kind of like dancing your way through a minefield.
Yeah, no, I've stepped on most of those mines before. And, after countless attempts, I'm still here. And I'm sure you'll get letters to everyone listening to this in California and Portland, writing Charna a letter complaint. Here's what I'd like you to do. Put that on a piece of paper and wipe your ass with it and flush it down the toilet because no one's listening anymore.
Well, what's really interesting, Mark, is I think that I have more listeners in, Guatemala, Turkey, Greece, like all of these
All over the
countries.
place, huh?
I get
That's
the
cool.
little I
That's
get these
cool.
little podcast alerts, it's like where is it ranking and holding high, And I feel like it ranks much higher. We just have way too many podcasts to listen to
Okay.
in
Cool.
in America. So, hopefully the people out there are laughing along with you.
That's good. I mean, there's this sort of cultural stuff, and I'm obsessed with cultures. And if you teach embodiment in Europe, you soon realize there's all these different embodiments very close together. I remember that was really tricky when I was in California when I met you. That people thought any kind of reference to culture was kind of racist or discriminatory. And in Europe, that's just a little bit different because you can drive 2 hours and be in another country, and like there's no when I was teaching in Ukraine, there was no denying culture. There's no denying culture. I've got a lot of good German jokes when I teach there, when I teach in France, God forbid. These cultures are quite close together. They're a 1 hour flight away, a lot of them, and they're real different for approaching embodiment, how you teach. It has to be really different. So that's become a bit of a speciality of the house in our coach training, I would say, that kind of cultural understanding piece.
I love that. That's awesome. So it's like do you have a photographic memory that you can log all of the different cultural jokes into? You keep them all
Hey,
organized.
boys, has come up. I mean, I was in sauna in Switzerland recently, and there was 17 rules written in German on the outside of the sauna, and obviously there was going to be some jokes about that, but it's I think I see the embodiments, right? Like every culture is an embodiment. Every culture is like if we use a model, it's this combination of length, width, and depth or whatever, right? Like English people a bit squashed this way, Irish a bit more owl. There's a French very specific. There's embodiments to all of them, which when you taste the embodiment, you can actually step into that culture. And that's great for empathy. It's great for building range. So, I love to step into the different cultures and feel the quality of Japaneseness or whatever it is. And, of course, we should be careful not to overgeneralize. And of course, there are subdivisions within any country. But, anyone who thinks culture doesn't exist just hasn't traveled. So it's a real, I think in terms of embodiment, we're always in contexts. So we have our own personal embodiment, but then, we have a relational embodiment like we've met, right? And then we have Another context would be a cultural embodiment, the environmental embodiment, right? If we were doing this interview in a cathedral, it'd be a very different interview than a cave, right? So we're always embodied in people and place and, all those things happening, whereas the kind of Western psychological model tends to view us as sort of isolated, Thatcherite kind of consumer individuals. I mean, looking at stress without looking at economics is ridiculous. It's, these are like big factors. So anyway, a little bit of a ramble there.
But a useful ramble. What practices around you mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I can't remember if it was in a conversation we were having here or before we started, but talking about vicarious trauma. So I'm thinking about the work that you were doing, and I know you're not doing it 90% of the time. It's 10% of your
like
time,
10%
but
deliberate.
the so the work in Ukraine, but also just, anytime that you're working with students, clients, what are you doing to manage your own stability, regulation, and prevent vicarious trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I say I teach coaches this is at least an hour-long lecture, right? But I mean, the main things are like, what's my capacity, knowing my capacity, and that can be like how many clients I have in a day. And that will be a very different number if it's British clients or Ukrainian clients. That's a very different number of how many I want to work with in a day. And then it's the subjectively, where am I at right now with my well-being, all the basic well-being factors. Sleep, I think, is way underestimated, exercise. And then, then there's what I do during, so that's state as I am. And then there's during the training, what do I do during the training with my own embodiment? It's different as your dog's just come in.
Yes. It's
Welcome, dog.
Elijah. Come on in.
Great. So yeah, like not welcoming in trainer trauma like a pleasant dog. There's things you do during the training, visualizations, and there's discharge techniques afterwards, like the TRE or whatever it is. I give a lot to nature as well. I'm a big believer in eco-regulation, so I spend a lot of time in nature. I find that very, very helpful. Who I'm around who's not traumatized, the right mixture of movement and stillness, aloneness, and social connection. So there's sort of two polarities, and if one isn't working, I go to the other one. Right, so if I'm isolating, you might need social support. If I'm dancing all the time, running around, I might need stillness. If I'm sitting on the couch on my own, I might need to go dance. So like there's a whole bunch of algorithms to run around that. But I think some of it's just the sort of wisdom that comes through experience, right? And just going, it's things like, I remember I taught in Sierra Leone for 10 days with traumatized soldiers without a co-trainer. That was like 15 years ago. I would never do that now. I'd refuse the job without a co-trainer. So, also the environmental conditions I was in there weren't great, so there's a whole bunch of factors. I mean, that's a training in and of itself, but hopefully that gives something useful to listeners.
Yeah. And what are you doing currently for yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of nature connection. So I have a kind of animist pagan-y practice. I've been studying with Josh Schrei, who I highly recommend. He's from the Emerald, which is a podcast of mine. So I've been studying with him and really getting into the sort of nature connection and mythology side of embodiment. So I've got practices around that. I'm a long-term meditator. That doesn't change. I do some breath work, pretty less than I used to. I lift weights. That has, the last few years, that's been a very consistent practice of, it's very simple and it helps me kind of hit a high so I can then relax afterwards. It's kind of two ways to relax, right? You can either relax directly or you can go up to go down. So I find weights really helps. It's very portable as well. With all the travel I do, it's really hard to get to a good fire rhythm studio or Aikido studio, but it's really good. It's really easy to get to a gym. I practice gratitude. I go to do 12-step programs and I dance once a week if at all possible. And beauty is another practice. I insist on being around beauty.
We have very similar practices. And I just have to say the Emerald Podcast. So I was going to be in that class with Josh and my friends and I decided we have a certain amount of skills among us that we created our own group. And so we pick a episode every month and, do practices in nature with it. And so I adore his podcast and I really appreciated that episode that you did with him.
Yeah, no, I interviewed him for my podcast, which it went quite well because I'd researched him a lot. Yeah, listeners should probably start with the revolution will not be psychologized. For all the over analytical, over therapeutic people, that would be Very, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
He says there's things you can do with ritual that you can't do with psychology.
Yeah.
So yeah, Josh is great. And, you know, we're very lucky, aren't we, these days, to what we have access to. I mean, there's so much. I mean, my life's mission was to make the world's embodied wisdom free to all. And I've kind of done that now, you know, like with the conferences we've done, with the podcast, with the YouTube channel. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Like one of our Instagram videos has got 2.7 million views.
That's amazing.
I literally couldn't have imagined that when we met 20 years ago when Instagram wasn't a thing. And, you know, like podcast, 3 million downloads. And I'm not boasting here. It's just like, I'm genuinely astounded. And now people can get access to the information with spending little or no money. You know, you might have to buy $50 of conference recordings or something, right? But like this, for example, if someone's a yoga teacher or a Feldenkrais Press teacher, there's like no excuse for not being trauma informed now. There's no excuse. Like you could spend a weekend listening to the best teachers in the world and learn enough to at least be sort of the basics, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we live in a wonderful time and that's very interesting. And there's, you know, it's crazy making time we're in, but I think the profusion of information, which in many ways does send us insane in this regard, I think is, you know, I had to fly to California and live in a hut to learn this stuff. You know, my friend Tessify had to have me fly to Ethiopia to train him. And like that kind of stuff just doesn't exist. That's not necessary anymore. Yeah. So that's pretty cool.
And you mentioned Paul Linden, who I read an article with, like, you know, 20 years ago or something, and I'd wanted to study with him and I didn't. How did you connect with Paul?
So Paul was involved in a peace project in the Middle East called Training Across Borders, which brought together people from war zones in Cyprus in the Green Line, which is the no man's land between North and South Cyprus. And that was founded by Don Levine, who was one of my main mentors, who was at the University of Chicago. Richard Strozzi Heckler was involved in that, various other people, but Paul was doing trauma work there because you can't do peace work without trauma work because otherwise everyone still wants to kill each other. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing Paul do a workshop with Israelis and Palestinians, pretty topical. And I remember it going pretty well. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, I don't know what this weird, funny little old Jewish guy is saying, but I like it. And I just said, hey, can I come stay with you? And he's pretty cool. His wife didn't like it much, but, you know, I came to live in his basement for a while and stayed in his dojo in Columbus, Ohio. He's got pretty late stage Parkinson's now. So if anyone wants to train with him, you better jump on it. Mm-hmm. He's still just about teaching. And he's a mentor, you know, I call him Pops, and I hosted him in the UK at least 10 times. You know, he's actually from Ukrainian heritage. So, you know, when I did the Ukraine project, there was this like beautiful full circle. And yeah, you know, he's been an elder and a very positive figure in my life. I think because he's in Columbus, Ohio, he doesn't have as much exposure as many of the big people. He's also terrible at marketing. Unfortunately, today, you know, a lot of the people who are better known just have the best marketing.
That's right.
And I've interviewed 500 people for the podcast. And I'd say half of them were good and half of them were just good salesmen. Yeah. So, you know, I'd say be careful of a good bullshitter, me included, you know, and you'll, as you do more of the podcast, you'll see this. So you'll have people on who would just talk a good talk. Mm-hmm. And then you'll have people like Paul who have lived it inside out. And, you know, that's unfortunately part of the consumer economy. And yeah, I spend more time than I would like kind of marketing and doing Instagram and things like that, but it's definitely got the word out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it's so important. And the democratization of information and tools and, especially embodiment tools. I mean, I'm grateful for that. And it's something that I also care deeply about. And so, you know, however it has to be done, you know, and the tool now is social media. So.
Yeah, it's a shame it's sending us all insane and censoring us. I mean, you know, having Silicon Valley in charge of our information, dating life, and possibly elections, I think is a horrible idea. And I think we recognize Google as the world's most powerful unelected body. You know, I think they're a better spy system than East Germany ever had. And I think we're being sent insane for profit. And Jack Hughes, you know, to use the French, like we need to stop thinking we're accidentally becoming insane. They are making us insane for profit, these companies. Mm-hmm. I'm tired of being censored on fucking Facebook when I say something that doesn't align with them politically, just being shadow banned to hell. Mm-hmm. And I'm tired of speaking to young people who are absolute nervous wrecks from the addictive and social pressures of these systems. I think we'll look at it in 20 years like we look at smoking now, you know, kind of, as, you know, they'll come with warning labels, I hope. So we'll see where that goes, but it may drive us all insane. Like over 50% of young American liberal women are now mentally ill. Over half are mentally ill. And like, that's an endemic. Like I never thought, I mean, I come from a family of crazy people, but that was, unusual then. So the fact that it's now usual is not accidental. And there are people who are responsible for that, as well as, bigger factors beyond anyone's control.
And so how do you make peace with that? Given that you are such a presence with using social media as a tool. So it's like it's for good and evil, right? It's both. And so
Yeah, it's more for evil. So I don't make peace with it. I'm definitely always debating quitting these platforms because I feel like I'm putting gold into the hands of demons. I would say that there is an element of how you use it. So for example, and this is, in our marketing more generally, I look what's from a Buddhist lens, like, are we creating fear? Are we creating greed? Or are we actually boosting some positive mind states? I know a lot of people like our newsletter because it's not, yes, we sell stuff, but we're not being like, buy this now or your kids will get cancer. That when it's a lot of humor, it's a lot of authenticity. I think there's a tantra in business, which is you're constantly pushed towards fear and greed. The three poisons, ignorance as well. And anyone who thinks they're not corruptible is either a saint or a liar. And I've noticed that, I had a big success 3 years ago and then everything kind of scaled up. It was a sort of overnight success, 10 years in the making. And there's definitely a temptation to start leaning into less. Yeah. And also there's like, are there platforms that you just go, you know what, this is Chinese spyware, I'm just not going to be on it. I think there are lines we can all make. You don't have to do social media, right? Like, it's become part of our company, and I'm questioning that for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'll be curious to see how it plays out for you and what you decide around this.
Yeah. There's decisions we've already made strategically. I think if you live in the real world, you kind of lean slowly away from things, but it's certainly a factor for me. I've kind of just in the last few months become increasingly aware of the harm that's done, and then go, do I want to be a part of this ethically? Like, that's a good question. So fair challenge.
Yeah. So as we're coming to a close, I'm curious if there's a brief exercise, a practice that you would like to guide our listeners through.
What's the practice? Okay, everyone reach behind them and take the stick out of your ass and just throw that as far away as you possibly can. There's the first practice. I mean, we could do a classic centering, right? Like that's, I find when I'm teaching coaches or aid workers or anyone, like centering goes a long way. So let's do an ABC. So easy one to remember. So aware, balance, core relaxation. So become aware of your body. And if that feels stressful, you can also become aware of the sounds all around you. Balance your posture. So you're a little more stable in your posture. So balancing your awareness so it's as symmetrical as possible. Core relaxation. Relax the eyes, your peripheral vision, the mouth, the belly, pelvic floor. And if you want to connect to someone who makes you smile or something meaningful to you, let's bring them to mind. 1 minute centering. I begin many of my coaching sessions. How's that feel? You've seen various over the years.
I'm very I'm porous for better and for worse, right? So I can feel other people deeply, and I can also change my states quite rapidly through a thought, right?
Yeah.
Right. But also through another person's thought. I'm definitely impacted by the world. So yeah, I do 1 minute meditations, and I've tried to do them like 1 minute, every hour as much as I can, to be with my thoughts, to be with my states, to become more conscious of subconscious material that's running in the background. Right.
Nice. I mean, the ABC is kind of designed that has different things that work for different people, because some people don't work well with posture or visualization or breath. So, it's kind of designed to be pretty, it can upregulate if you're down, regulate if you're down, it can downregulate if you're up. And the other one obviously is your own embodiment, right? Like, I took just 2 seconds before I did that just to calm down a little bit because I was quite, a little bit, positively activated by doing an interview and talking about it. I mean, we have an exercise where I train coaches where they have to just say bananas to each other in really calming ways. So they're sort of like bananas, bananas, bananas. And then they have to upregulate. Like bananas, bananas, bananas. They have to kind of use the voice and the embodiment because that matters even more than the actual technique, right? Like the technique's like 10%. So, I train embodiment coaches, most of the training is their embodiment. And then the last third is techniques. So.
Well, and what you're touching on there, I do a nervous system regulation kind of body work that I like to teach couples to do with each other. And it's just really, it's calming and addressing pre-verbal trauma or pre-verbal states. And the first thing that I do is have the partner who is about to touch their partner who's laying on their side like a little spoon, to become a vessel of love, basically, to get grounded, to pick the place that makes them the most relaxed. Like for me, it's a body of water or forest. So it's like getting really calm inside themselves before they touch, before they make contact, to get
No, I love
clear in their thoughts.
Spooning therapy. It sounds wonderful. I need to go to the Bay Area again. I'm going to be in New York and Austin this year, but not the Bay Area. But for spooning therapy, I might get on a plane.
Yeah. Well, the one person is the spoon, and the other person's sitting upright. But yes, if you come, I will. Some friends or some clients call it the hold, cuddle therapy, all the things, right? So if you come, I will show you, Mark.
All right, that's a promise.
Offer.
That's a
It's
promise.
an offer. Yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah. So one last question: what is embodied freedom to you?
Choice. The choice not to be the bitch of your habits. So I was kind of joking with students the other day. I said, don't be a habitch. Like we don't really want.
I like that.
Like there's no freedom if you're just letting your habits push you around and you're not actually choosing how to behave according to the situation and your values. So for me, embodied freedom is just being centered enough to go, hey, do I want to do I have a part of me that's Irish, right? Like I have a part of me that just wants to like run across green hills and kill English people. And like, if I let that part run the show all the time, my life's going to get worse and I'm going to do unethical things, right? So I've got a choice. Do I want to be in that? If I have enough awareness, I can have enough choice. So it's awareness and choice. Simple awareness and choice. That if you don't have awareness, you don't have choice. So yeah, that's what embodied freedom, I guess, is to me, just off the cuff. There's something more though. There's something about, because that's an individualistic answer and it's a standard one for me, but there's something like, I want to live in a world where we all have kind of resources to make choices, because you're not in a context-free environment, right? Like someone who's really poor is not in Sudan is not in the same context we're in to make choices here. Yeah. So for me, there's got to be a bigger piece there. Got to be a bigger piece. And I would like people to talk more about economies and class again, rather than the obsessions, which I think are just a smokescreen that everyone's obsessed with.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to share before we complete?
No, I think we're nearly there. Just kind of feeling into the rhythm of the session. I think we're pretty much towards the end. Shall I tell people where to find me online or any of that stuff?
Yes, that's what I was about to ask. Like, how can people find you? How can they reach you?
Tinder, Grindr. No, they can find me through all the normal channels. So if you put embodiment into the internet, I will come up. Our main site is called Embodiment Unlimited, and there's loads of resources there for coaches, including a free copy of my book, Embodiment, which has sold thousands of copies, but we've got a free PDF there. People seem to really like it. It's embodimentunlimited.com. I am on Instagram. If you just put in Mark Walsh, WLSH, YouTube, podcast, I don't know, spray painting onto the moon. I get around a little bit, but they're the main areas.
And of course, all that information will be in my show notes. So, yeah.
Charna, pleasure. Super generous. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. If you appreciated this episode, please like, rate, review, and share it with your friends. I really appreciate that. If you'd like to stay connected, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at LaidOPEN Podcast. That's LaidOPEN Podcast. As well as if you go to charnacassell.com and join my newsletter, you'll get information about upcoming courses, you'll get discounts, as well as resources that I share in my newsletter. And at passionatelife.org, you can get more information about my private practice and the kind of work that I do. This has been LaidOPEN Podcast with your host, Charna Cassell. Until next time, may this podcast connect you to new resources that empower you to heal. Thank you so much for listening.